At the time of recording this video, President Trump is widely expected to sign an executive order intended to dismantle the Department of Education. One of the primary functions of the Department of Education is to oversee funding for special education services. I'm Dr. Eric Newman, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I specialize in the evaluation of neurodevelopmental disabilities. So that's autism, ADHD, and learning disabilities predominantly, but others as well. And in that role, I often make recommendations to families that are needed to meet children's educational needs, as well as their clinical needs. So in this video, we're going to talk about how dismantling the Department of Education could be very harmful to children with disabilities and to children's mental health in general. So I think it's important to start with talking about what does the Department of Education do? The Department of Education does a number of things, but the three biggest things they do really is to oversee federal funding programs for, number one, financial assistance for colleges, number two, funding for students with disabilities, and number three, funding for Title I grants, programs intended to serve low-income families or students. So why does President Trump want to dismantle the Department of Education then? Well, the traditional argument for dismantling the Department of Education really goes back to almost when it was created, which is that Republicans believe that smaller government is better, and this represents government overreach, and they want to give control of educational issues to the states and local governments. However, President Trump has also taken advantage of what he sees as an opportunity with his base, and that is that they want more control over their children's education. And this really comes down to things like critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or DEI, things that conservative parents believe are going on, and they believe that children are being affected by these things, and they want to do away with those. We can talk in a different video about what these things really are and how they're predominantly just fabricated in order to sell this idea that we should be giving control back to the states. But more importantly, for the purposes of this discussion, the Department of Education doesn't even do these things. They don't set those curriculum issues. So gutting the Department of Education is really going to have no impact on this at all, unless your view is that we shouldn't be providing any support for children who are sick or disabled or economically disadvantaged. Okay, so what would happen to the functions of the Department of Education if it were dismantled? Well, this is a little bit unclear. For some people, they want to move those functions. So, for example, they would want to move the financial aid parts of the Department of Education to the Treasury Department. And they would move the special education parts of the Department of Education over to the Department of Health and Human Services. And then they would move the kind of civil rights and Title I issues over to the Department of Justice. But then there's other people who don't want to move these functions around, and instead they just want to get rid of all of this at the federal level, and they just want to say, states deal with this stuff. Real quick, if you're getting value from this video, I'd appreciate it if you'd like, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you can get more videos just like this. Okay, so how would dismantling the Department of Education affect children's mental health? Well, the Department of Education currently oversees funding of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. The mandate of IDEA is to provide what they call FAPE, which means Free Appropriate Public Education. And so what they're mandated to do is remove barriers to FAPE by providing appropriate services and accommodations for children who need that. So one of the primary ways this is done is through the special education process. So if you've ever heard of an individualized education program, or an IEP, this is how the IDEA gets to the point of providing special education services. So the Department of Education is then providing federal funding for children with speech language impairments, autism, specific learning disorders, emotional and behavioral disturbance, and a whole host of other disabilities. And this is then what gives them access to specially designed instruction, related services such as speech language and occupational therapy and counseling and social skills and things like that. And it also gives them access to accommodations through their IEP. Now, the Department of Education also oversees implementation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which means if you've heard of a 504 plan or a 504 accommodation plan, these are kids who don't necessarily need an IEP, but they still need accommodations, and they get that because it's illegal for schools to discriminate against them based on their disability, so they have to provide accommodations. So let's look at the possibilities for dismantling the Department of Education. Let's say they decide to move these functions around, and they move the special education services to the Department of Health and Human Services. I could imagine a world in which that might be a good idea. One of my mantras has always been that we treat health and education as two completely separate things when we know that both health and education are essential to developing a fully functional human being. I often see kids who in schools get denied an IEP or access to services or accommodations because the school says they don't see how the disability impacts their school performance, even though, let's say, they have autism and it really affects how they process and respond to information in every domain, including at school, even if they can't see it. I also see kids who come to me for academic testing because even though the school is supposed to provide academic testing, either they don't or they're not doing it in a full enough way. And so they need me to provide academic testing. And I end up not being able to charge that to insurance because under the health system, insurance is not expected to cover things that are considered educational. So having these things in two separate areas and kind of siloed in that way is not great. So I can imagine a world in which these things are more aligned, but do I actually expect that to happen if we're just dismantling the Department of Education? No, probably not. On the other hand, there are definitely ways that dismantling the Department of Education can hurt kids with disabilities. When we talk about DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, well, what do you think special education is? What do you think children with disabilities are? They are neurodiversity. It's a different way of processing and responding. That is diversity. And serving them means offering equity, which is giving kids what they need, and inclusion, having them be a part of the educational process. And then this gets at actually a civil rights issue. If a disability is a form of diversity and we're not protecting people with disabilities, then that becomes a civil rights issue. And if we house the special education stuff at the Department of Health and Human Services, but then we have the civil rights people over at the Department of Justice, they're not working together anymore. And that makes it a lot harder for kids with disabilities to have that protection. Now, what if instead of moving these things around to different federal departments, we just move it all back to the states? Well, this would almost certainly make it more difficult for kids with disabilities to get what they need. And this is the frustrating thing, is that when you move that back to the states, you've got different states who are going to prioritize those initiatives at different levels, which means if you live in California or New York, your state is probably still going to vote to fund those things no matter how hard it is. They might increase taxes to do it, but their children are going to get educated one way or another. It's the conservative states, the ones who are actually supporting these policies, where they're going to choose not to do that. And then those children are the ones who are going to struggle most. Parents of children with disabilities already struggle so much to get their children's IEP goals met and to get the services that they need. The IDEA actually specifies that the federal government can fund up to 40% of special education services, yet what we've actually done in practice is to fund about 13%. So we're already underfunding special education to the tune of that 27%. So where does that money come from? Well, the difference is actually made up by the states. The states and the school districts, local governments, they come together and they try to fill that gap that the federal government is already not providing. But trying to fill that gap places a huge burden on the states. So children with disabilities are already getting less than what they need. I see this every day in my work. Parents are coming to me because they're desperate to get whatever proof they need to show the school to get them to agree that these services are needed. And the lack of funding that we're already seeing, which translates to a lack of services now, is already creating a situation where they're not able to provide the services that they need. And when you have a neurodevelopmental disorder of some kind, essentially your brain, the environment that's set up for you is not a good fit for how your brain processes and responds to information. And in that context of that mismatch, it's really hard for children to learn academic skills at the level that they're intellectually capable of. Not only that, but it results in significant anxiety when you're constantly banging your head up against the wall trying to operate in a system that's not well suited for how you operate. And eventually learned helplessness sets in. You start to feel like there's nothing you can do about it, which leads to depression. So you've got anxiety and depression. And then on top of that, you've got, school dropouts, substance abuse. Eventually you've got, people who can't function independently, people who can't hold down a job as adults, people who can't maintain their relationships. So we're setting these kids up for failure by not providing these services early. And this is actually the rule more than the exception. The vast majority of kids who I see, who I evaluate and diagnose with neurodevelopmental disorders of some kind, also have anxiety, also have depression. And it's for exactly this reason. So a lot of times parents will try to avoid these problems by taking their kids out of the public school system, putting them either, homeschooling, or put them in a charter school, which is still part of the public school system, or they'll put them in a private school. And for some of them, that might be a good fit. But for the vast majority of them, they're not able to get what they need at those places because a private school is not bound by the same laws. They don't have the same protections. And while they might be able to offer some accommodations here and there, they're not equipped to provide those kinds of services that these kids need, unless they're specifically a school that specializes in those areas, in serving the needs of children with disabilities. And then if that's the case, you remove the kids from opportunities to socialize with their neurotypical peers in favor of putting them in this special setting, which then they lose other opportunities. Even charter schools, which are technically public schools, are set up differently. They're often not held to the same standards, and it's more difficult for kids to get their needs met in those settings than it is in the public school setting, where they have the flexibility and the sort of purchasing power to make all of that happen. So providing these services to kids in schools early on is critical to their life success. And trying to dismantle the Department of Education when it can have all these side effects can really set kids up for lifelong failure. At the same time, kids in the general education classroom suffer as well. We said earlier that when the federal government already isn't funding at 40%, but they're funding at 13%, and there's that 27% discrepancy, and state governments, school districts, they're making up that difference. How do you think they're making up that difference? They're doing it by diverting funds for general education programs to meet the needs of special education so that they can meet that mandate that is not being funded. What are the consequences of that? Well, they can't hire enough teachers. They don't have the funding for competitive teacher salaries. It increases class sizes. It lowers the quality of education. So everybody suffers. And when that happens in the general education setting, you can actually create the same kinds of problems, the anxiety, the depression, in otherwise typically developing kids who are totally fine. You're going to create that problem in them as well by not meeting their educational needs. So hopefully you can see how this idea of dismantling the Department of Education has potentially devastating consequences, not just for children with disabilities, but for all students. There's no doubt that schools are struggling to meet the needs of their students. But removing this oversight and these protections and the services that this funding gives to schools, even though it's underfunded now and they're not doing a great job of it now because it's underfunded, it would be even worse if they didn't have those funds and states had to bend over even further backwards to meet that gap. This is going to impact families with children with disabilities as well as families with neurotypical children, and it's going to impact families on both sides of the political aisle. So please urge President Trump not to do this to your children. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.